The alien empire had waited for this moment for centuries, and their leaders believed no force could stop them, because they had created the strongest soldiers the galaxy had ever seen, with bodies taller and stronger than humans, and with armor that could resist heavy fire, and weapons that could melt tanks and fleets of ships that could blot out the skies. And when they finally chose Earth as their next target, they were certain it would be an easy conquest, and they sent their warships toward the blue planet with the confidence of hunters closing in on helpless prey. But Earth was not helpless, at least not in the way they thought. People on Earth saw the skies darken as the alien fleet arrived, and fear spread quickly across every nation because no one had ever seen such power before, and leaders around the world scrambled to form plans. But no strategy seemed enough against the endless enemy ships that now circled the planet, and news stations reported the invasion with trembling voices while families hid inside their homes and cities prepared for chaos. But far away from the noise of governments and armies in a quiet little town, an old man named Jack Carter lived alone in a small wooden house on the edge of town. And while the world panicked, Jack sat on his porch in silence. Jack Carter had once been a Marine who fought battles far from home and who carried memories that never left him. But after years of war, he had chosen peace, and he had walked away from the life of guns and blood and noise, and he had promised himself he would never return to it. And in the little town he had found quiet days with his fishing rod, the old rifle he kept only for hunting, and the company of neighbors who knew him simply as the quiet man with calm eyes. But on the day the alien ships appeared, Jack felt something deep inside him stir, because he knew the sound of war when it came, even if it came from the stars. The ground began to shake as the first alien landing ships descended near the countryside, and people from the town ran to gather their families and drive away. But Jack stayed on his porch, watching the sky burn with fire as the massive ships roared down, and the earth trembled beneath their weight. And though his face was calm, his eyes followed every movement with the sharp focus of a soldier who had seen invasions before. And from the dirt road that led into town, a young woman named Claire came running, her breath heavy and her voice tight with fear. She knew Jack was once a soldier because everyone in town had heard the stories, though he never spoke about them, and she begged him to help because the aliens were coming and people did not know what to do, and she told him that the police and the mayor had no answers, and the families were terrified and children were crying, and they needed someone who understood war. And Jack listened, but he shook his head and said he was done with fighting and that he was no longer a soldier and that his war had ended long ago. Claire stared at him with wide eyes filled with desperation and anger, and she asked him how he could sit there while families were being dragged from their homes, and how he could watch the sky burn and do nothing when he once fought to protect people he did not even know. And her words stung Jack more than he admitted, because inside him the old instincts had never died. And as night came, he sat alone thinking about the war he had left behind, and the war that was now coming to his doorstep. And for the first time in many years he felt the weight of a choice he could not avoid. The morning after the first alien ships landed, the small town was filled with panic, because people had seen the giant machines move across the horizon, and no one knew how to fight them, and many families packed their cars with whatever they could carry and drove away, hoping the aliens would not notice them, and the streets were empty except for a few who stayed behind because they had no place to go. And Jack Carter sat in his kitchen drinking coffee, staring out the window at the quiet road while the sound of alien engines echoed faintly in the distance like a storm slowly moving closer. Claire returned to his house, her eyes red from a night of fear, and she told him that alien patrols had entered nearby towns and they were pulling people from their homes and forcing them into strange machines, and no one knew where they were being taken. And she said people needed him because he understood war, and that if he did not act, the aliens would crush them all. And Jack listened without saying a word because he did not want to admit what he already knew inside, that the war had found him again, whether he liked it or not. Later that day, Jack stood on his porch watching the road when he saw the dust rise in the distance, and soon heavy footsteps shook the ground as the first alien patrol appeared, marching into town, and they were taller than any man, with shining black armor and weapons that glowed with heat, and they walked as if nothing could harm them, and their voices were mechanical and cold as they demanded that the humans surrender and come forward, and no one dared to move because the sight of them froze people with fear. But Jack felt his old instincts take control, as if his body remembered what his mind had tried to forget. He walked back inside and took the hunting rifle from the wall, the one he had not touched in years except for deer season, and he checked the chamber, and his hands moved steady and sure like they always had, and he looked out the window at the aliens as they spread through the street searching for signs of life, and he knew he could not fight them head-on because their weapons were too strong. But he also knew that every army, no matter how powerful, had weaknesses, and he had spent his life learning how to find them. As the aliens began pulling people from their homes, Jack slipped quietly through the back of his house and moved into the alley using shadows for cover, and every step felt familiar as if he was back, in uniform on a mission far away. And he set small traps along the narrow paths, simple devices he had built with what little he had, and then he waited for the moment to strike, and when one of the aliens turned its back, Jack pulled the trigger, and the rifle cracked through the silence, and the bullet struck the weak point near the neck joint, and the alien fell with a heavy thud. The others turned with rage, and their weapons glowed with fire, but Jack had already moved through the shadows, drawing them into the alley where the traps exploded with sharp blasts of heat and smoke filling the air, and the narrow space worked against their size and strength, and Jack picked them off one by one, never staying in one place, never letting them aim, and soon the terrifying squad that had marched into town was nothing more than broken armor. Scattered in the dust and silence returned to the street, broken only by the cries of relief from the families who had been captured. Claire came, running, her face pale with shock as she saw the fallen soldiers, and she asked how he had done it, when no one else could even stand against them. And Jack only said that every army could bleed if you learned how to strike. And she looked at him with new respect and told him that people would need to see this because they had lost all hope. And if they knew the aliens could be beaten, they might find the courage to resist. And Jack felt a heavy weight in his chest because he knew she was right, and once again he was no longer just Jack Carter, the quiet man on the edge of town. He was a soldier, and war had returned to his life whether he wanted it or not. The night after the battle in the alley, the small town was quiet again, but it was not the same kind of quiet because people whispered about what Jack had done, and they gathered in small groups, talking in low voices, saying that one man had destroyed the squad that no one believed could be touched, and for the first time since the sky filled with ships there was something other than fear. There was a spark of hope, and Claire moved among them, telling them she had seen it with her own eyes, and that the aliens were not untouchable, and that if one man could fight them, then maybe they all could stand together. Jack sat at his kitchen table cleaning the old rifle and staring at the pieces of broken armor he had dragged back from the fight, and he studied the shape of the plating and the joints, and he saw where the bullets had worked and where they had failed. And he thought about how the aliens moved and how they reacted, and he realized they were trained to fight with numbers and power, but not against someone who used patience and shadows and the land itself. And he understood that the secret was not to match their strength, but to use what they never expected. And as he thought, he knew this was only the beginning because the aliens would return. The next morning, Claire came to him again, but this time she was not afraid, she was determined, and she told him that more people wanted to fight, and that they would follow his lead if he showed them how. And she said they had nothing left to lose because if they ran, the aliens would find them anyway, and if they hid, the aliens would drag them away. And she looked him in the eye and said that he had given them hope, and now he could not take it away. And Jack listened, in silence, but deep down he knew she was right because the battle was not just his anymore. It belonged to everyone who wanted to live free. That afternoon, the sound of alien engines returned and the ground shook as more patrols moved through the countryside, and Jack saw from a distance that they were searching more carefully now, scanning with drones and moving in tighter formation, because they had learned from their first loss, and he knew that the next fight would be harder. And so he walked into the town square where the people waited with fear and curiosity, and he told them in a steady voice that if they wanted to live, they had to learn to fight. And he showed them how to move quietly, how to watch the enemy, how to build traps, from simple tools, and how to use the hills and forests as shields, and every word came from years of experience that he thought he had left behind. The people listened and learned quickly, because they were desperate, and soon small groups began to practice under his guidance, and Claire helped organize them, writing down what Jack taught and making sure everyone shared supplies. And at night they built hiding places and set up lines of defense around the town, and when the aliens came again, they were met not with silence and fear, but with ambushes from the shadows and traps that exploded beneath their heavy steps. And though the townsfolk were afraid, their courage grew each time they saw the invincible enemy Jack fought alongside them, moving through the fields and alleys, striking and vanishing before the aliens could lock on with their weapons. And he taught them never to stand still, never to meet the enemy in open ground, always to think one step ahead. And as the battles continued, the people grew stronger and more confident, and whispers spread beyond the town into nearby villages that a retired Marine was leading a resistance, and that humans were not as helpless as the aliens believed. And the whispers became stories, and the stories became a movement. The alien commanders grew angry as reports came in of missing patrols and broken machines and stolen supplies, and they sent stronger forces to crush the resistance. But each time they marched into the countryside, they found themselves cut off from their supply lines, ambushed in narrow valleys and trapped in forests that burned with fire and smoke. And the more they fought, the more they realized that their perfect army was bleeding against farmers and mechanics and shopkeepers who should have been powerless but who now fought with the skill and cunning of soldiers, because Jack Carter had shown them how. One night after a long battle, Jack stood on a hilltop looking at the horizon where the alien ships still hung in the sky like dark clouds, and he knew the war was far from over. But as he listened to the cheers of the people below, he felt something he had not felt in years. He felt pride, not for himself, but for the strength of the people who had chosen to fight. And he knew that the aliens had made one mistake. They thought Earth would be easy, but they had never faced humans who refused to surrender, and he knew they were only just beginning to understand what kind of war they had started. The alien leaders were furious because their patrols were not returning, and their supply convoys were disappearing, and every report spoke of humans fighting back with a strength and cleverness that should not have been possible. And they learned that it was not armies or governments leading the resistance, but a single man who had once been a soldier and now stood as the heart of the rebellion, and they decided to crush him by sending stronger units with heavier armor and more machines. But they did not understand that by then it was no longer only about one man, because Jack Carter had already planted the seed of defiance in the people, and they were ready to stand with him. In the small town, Jack had turned farmers and mechanics into fighters, and he had taught them how to move like soldiers and how to turn ordinary tools into weapons. And they no longer looked at the aliens as untouchable monsters, but as enemies who could fall. And every day more people joined them, carrying whatever they could use to fight, and Claire worked tirelessly to keep them organized, making sure that food was shared and wounded were cared for, and messages were carried between groups. And she became Jack's second voice, and the people trusted her as much as they trusted him. One evening, as the sun set red over the fields, Jack gathered them all near the rail yard, where broken machines from old times lay rusting, and he told them that the aliens would come in greater numbers and with stronger weapons, but that strength was nothing if you learned to think faster and move smarter. And he reminded them that the land was theirs, and they knew every hill and forest and river, and that the aliens did not, and that if they stayed sharp and used their minds, they could turn every corner of Earth into a trap. And when he spoke, the people listened with steady eyes because they no longer doubted his words. The next attack came at night when the alien machines rolled into the town with glowing lights scanning every building, and the ground shook beneath their weight and people trembled in their hiding places. But Jack signaled calmly, and the fighters he had trained moved into position. And from the rooftops, fire rained down on the alien patrols, and from the alleys, explosions tore into their machines, and the night filled with smoke and screams. But the people did not break, and they fought with everything they had. And when dawn came, the street was littered with broken armor, and the survivors cheered because they had once again held their ground. The aliens grew cautious after that, and they no longer marched openly into the town but spread out across the countryside, trying to cut off the humans from food and water. And Jack knew that this was their real strategy, because they wanted to starve the people into surrender. And so he led raids against their convoys, striking fast and vanishing before the aliens could regroup, and each victory gave them more supplies and weapons, and the resistance grew stronger while the aliens became angrier and more frustrated, and the balance of power began to shift slowly. Claire proved herself again and again by keeping spirits high when fear tried to creep in, and she told the people stories of how Jack had defeated the first squad alone, and she reminded them that every day they survived was another day. The aliens failed, and Jack watched her with quiet respect, because he knew that without her words, the fire he had lit might not have burned so brightly, and together they built something stronger than soldiers. They built belief, and belief was more dangerous to the aliens than bullets. Soon nearby towns began to rise up after hearing what had happened, and groups of fighters came to join Jack, bringing more strength to the resistance. And when he looked around at them, he saw faces that were no longer filled with fear, but with determination. And he realized that the war was no longer about hiding and surviving. It was about fighting back and making the aliens pay for every step of Earth they tried to take. And though he carried the weight of leadership heavily, he never showed it, because he knew they looked to him for courage, and he could not let them see doubt. The alien commanders then made their most dangerous decision, because they sent their elite warriors bred only for war and larger and stronger than any soldiers seen before. And when Jack learned of this, he did not panic. He simply prepared, and he led his people to the old rail yard, and together they turned it into a fortress of traps and ambush points and tunnels. And when the night came and the ground began to tremble beneath the heavy steps of the elite, Jack stood at the front, calm and ready, and he whispered to himself that Earth was his home and no one would take it while he still breathed. The night of the great battle began with silence, and the people waited in the rail yard, hidden among the shadows of rusted machines and broken tracks. And they listened to the distant rumble that grew louder with every second, until the ground shook and the air trembled, and out of the smoke came the alien elite soldiers, taller than any human, with armor that shimmered like steel fire, and weapons that glowed red with energy. And behind them marched heavy machines that rolled forward, crushing the old metal beneath their weight, and the sight of them made many hearts falter. But Jack Carter stood steady at the front, and his calm presence was enough to make others grip their weapons tighter. He gave the signal, and the first traps detonated. As the aliens entered the yard, and explosions lit up the night, sending fire and metal into the air, and the ground shook as machines toppled. But the elite kept marching through smoke and flames as if they were unstoppable, and Jack shouted for his fighters to hold the line, and they opened fire from rooftops and tunnels, raining bullets and homemade rockets on the enemy. And the noise was like thunder that never ended, and the night became a storm of fire and screams and steel. But the people did not run. They fought with a fury born of survival. Jack moved like the soldier he had once been, using cover, moving fast, striking where it hurt, and vanishing before the enemy could lock on him. And he called out orders clear and sharp, guiding the fighters as if they had trained for years, and Claire fought beside him, fearless and quick, saving more than one life that night with her courage and sharp aim. And together they pushed their people to fight harder and longer than anyone believed possible, and the aliens who had come to crush them found themselves trapped in a battlefield that belonged to humans, not to machines. The elite warriors were powerful, and they struck with weapons that burned through walls and sent fire across the ground, but Jack had studied them, and he knew their armor had weak points near the joints and at the back of the head, and he guided his fighters to aim for those places. And slowly, one by one, the giants began to fall, and every time one hit the ground, the people shouted with a roar that cut through the fear and gave them strength to fight harder. And the aliens began to realize that their perfect soldiers were bleeding on Earth. The rail yard became a battlefield of smoke and chaos, and Jack fought hand to hand with one of the elites when his rifle ran empty and the giant struck with crushing force. But Jack rolled aside and grabbed a piece of broken steel, driving it into the gap in the armor, and the warrior fell with a roar that shook the ground, and Jack stood breathing heavy but unbroken. And those who saw him believed he was more than a man. In that moment, they believed he was the spirit of Earth itself. Refusing to bow, Claire was everywhere at once, carrying ammunition, pulling the wounded to safety and shouting for the fighters to stand their ground, and she moved with the same fire that burned in Jack's eyes, and together they held the people steady, even when the night seemed lost. And when the alien machines broke through the outer defenses, Jack signaled for the last line of traps, and the old fuel tanks hidden beneath the yard exploded with a force that tore the machines apart, and the blast lit the sky like a second sun, and the shock wave threw both human and alien to the ground. When the smoke cleared, the rail yard was a ruin of fire and twisted metal and broken bodies. But the elite soldiers lay scattered among the wreckage, their shining armor cracked and their weapons silent, and the survivors of the town stood slowly with disbelief on their faces, because they had faced the strongest army in the galaxy, and they had not been crushed. They had endured, and they had won. And the cheers that rose from the people were loud enough to carry across the countryside and reached the ears of those who still doubted. Jack stood with blood on his face and dust in his hair. But his eyes were steady as he looked at the survivors, and he told them that they had proven something greater than victory. They had proven that humans could not be broken by fear or by machines, and that as long as they stood together, they would never be conquered. And the people listened in silence before they raised their voices in one united roar, because they knew, now that they were not prey, they were warriors, and the galaxy would have to learn that truth. The night was heavy with smoke and silence after the battle, and Alex sat on the broken steps of the ruined church, staring at the sky that still glowed with faint red light from the fires that refused to die. He held his rifle across his knees. Though he no longer expected another wave to come for the first time in weeks, the ground did not shake with the march of alien machines, and the air did not carry the cold metallic voice of enemy commanders demanding surrender. Around him, survivors began to gather. Some were civilians with dirt-stained faces and clothes torn from running through the forest. Some were young fighters who had followed Alex when no one else stood for them. They looked at him now with a mix of awe and exhaustion, waiting for him to say what came next. Alex did not speak. At first he remembered the moment when the alien super army broke and ran. He had seen the disbelief in their faces when their technology failed against the stubborn will of humans. He had watched their mighty armor shatter under the combined force of homemade explosives. In sheer courage he had seen commanders retreat with fear. In their glowing eyes the invincible army had fallen, and Earth still stood. He knew the fight was not over, but for now it was a victory. Beside him, Lisa walked slowly with a limp, her arm still wrapped in bandages from the last clash. She sat down near him with a sigh. She said nothing, but her eyes told Alex she trusted him, and that trust was heavy, because he was just a retired Marine who wanted peace. Yet here he was carrying the weight of an entire planet. From the distance came the sound of an engine. A battered truck rolled into the ruined square, and from it stepped soldiers in uniforms. Not from his small band, but from the remains of a National Guard unit. Their leader, a young man named Daniel, approached with cautious respect. He told Alex that across the country, similar stories had begun to spread. Aliens defeated not by fleets or advanced weapons, but by scattered human resistance led by people like Alex. He said the Council of Nations was trying to reform, to stand together again, and he asked Alex if he would come to guide them. Alex shook his head. He was tired. His bones ached and his heart longed for silence, but he looked at the faces around him, at Lisa, at the survivors, at Daniel, and he knew he could not walk away. He said he was no leader, he was just a soldier, but if Earth needed him, he would not abandon it. The days that followed were strange. The alien army had not vanished completely. Pockets of them still roamed, trying to regroup, but without their central command, they were scattered and confused. Alex led strikes against them, using the same simple tactics that had worked before: ambushes, traps, sheer determination. The humans grew bolder each day, and soon even the aliens began to realize their defeat was final. One evening, Alex walked through the camp and saw children playing with sticks, pretending they were rifles. He saw old men fixing radios to reach distant voices. He saw hope rising where despair once lived. He felt pride, but also a deep sorrow, because he knew the cost had been high. Cities lay in ruins, families torn apart, millions gone, but humanity was still alive, and that was something the aliens could never understand. News finally arrived that the alien mothership, which had orbited Earth since the beginning, had left its orbit. It drifted toward the void. Silent and broken, Alex and his fighters watched from the hills as the bright streak of light faded into the darkness. Some cheered, some cried. Alex only watched with calm eyes, knowing that though one enemy was gone, the universe was wide, and others might come someday. That night under the stars, Lisa asked him what he would do. Now Alex thought for a long time. He said he wanted to return to his small house near the coast. If it still stood, he wanted to sit on the porch and listen to the sea. But he also said he would be ready if the call ever came again, because Earth was his home and he would never let it fall. The survivors listened to his words and carried them in their hearts when they rebuilt their homes. They remembered the Marine who stood when no one else did when they trained new soldiers. They spoke his name as an example when they taught their children. They told the story of the retired man who faced the alien super army and did not run. Years later, when the land began to heal, and the cities rose again, people would still gather to speak of the day the invincible fell. They would say that machines and weapons could not conquer Earth because Earth was not just land or sky. It was people, stubborn, unyielding people who refused to bow. They would say that one man showed them how to fight and how to endure. And in a quiet house by the coast, Alex sat with the waves at his door. His rifle hung on the wall, gathering dust. He grew old, but his eyes still carried the fire of that war. He never sought glory, but his name lived on in whispers and songs, because when the alien superarmy came to conquer Earth, it met not just a retired Marine but the spirit of humanity itself.